everyone. This is Raphael.
I'm Loryn.
We're the Pacheco siblings, and welcome to the Hypercube podcast, a talk show in which two siblings converse about anything and everything. Here we are again. So, should we talk about masculinity?
You want to talk about masculinity?
Well, we were just talking about masculinity before we started recording. Particularly, you're talking about Tucker Carlson, but that's a whole different can of worms.
Yeah.
That we probably don't necessarily need to get into, because it gets weird.
For those of you outside of like the US, bear with us.
Oh my goodness, my gain is huge again.
Oh my, what the heck?
All right, I might be adjusting on the fly here tonight. Live mixing, the joys of podcasting.
Yeah.
Well, we were talking
live.
Well, we were talking about another thing directly beforehand, though. That was a different conversation. But I was telling you a little bit about Mars Hill. Mm-hmm. So for you, you're not necessarily in like the American church evangelical world. That's like a bit foreign to you. So you get most of your news about that world from me.
I get all of my news about that from you.
So you didn't listen to the massive hit podcast that is The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill last year.
I did not listen to it. However, I feel like I have because of how much we've talked about it.
Yeah, I've talked about it a fair bit. Everybody, I think, in American evangelicalism talked about The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill a fair bit. It was a bit controversial. It was a bit divisive in some ways, in very surprising ways sometimes, insofar as a lot of people thought it was too critical of Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill, and a lot of people thought it wasn't nearly critical enough.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like that's a good testament to how fine of a balance they struck.
Right. So if you average it out, they did exactly perfect.
Yeah, precisely. It's a very well-produced show, though. Very excellent. They finished it, I think, late last year. They actually did a bonus episode very recently, just a couple weeks ago, very, very long after its conclusion. However, yeah, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the main gist of it, because I haven't really had too many people with whom to converse and try and break down some of the stuff I've been thinking on and meditating on about that podcast and about that story. So for those who don't know, Mars Hill was this massive mega church. It was an American mega church headed by Pastor Mark Driscoll, and it had a very meteoric rise and fall. Mark Driscoll was a very gifted young preacher who quickly rose to extreme fame and popularity. And back in like the mid 2010s, that church fell apart and there was a lot of scandal. There was a lot of news of very toxic internal leadership culture that revolved around Mark Driscoll. And eventually all that stuff came to light and the church was dismantled. But it had a huge legacy, impacted a lot of people. Obviously, it's a mega church, so they had a lot of members. And it really changed the course of a lot of people's lives. Then all of a sudden, a lot of it kind of went away overnight. There was a podcast series produced by Christianity Today, which is one of the bigger evangelical media outlets in the American evangelical world. They produced this podcast, which kind of, I was telling you, it's basically produced like a true crime podcast.
Right.
It very much has that tone and vibe, that kind of true crime documentary style. But yeah, they basically go in a really deep dive into that story. But I was showing you a little bit beforehand clip of Mark Driscoll in his famous "How Dare You" sermon clip,
right?
Which, if you don't know, if you haven't seen that, you could just search Mark Driscoll "How Dare You" and it'll pop up. In fact, if you just type in Mark Driscoll, when I was going on YouTube, if you click like down for like the suggested search results, it's the first one.
Yeah,
which was this viral clip of him yelling at the men in his congregation.
Yeah, we might leave a clip in the show notes.
Oh, yes, I can put that in the show notes as well. So, yeah, I was curious what your take on that was, because you seem to have notes immediately after I showed you that.
Okay, well...
But I was telling you, I prefaced it with basically saying this was Mark Driscoll's brand, and this was very much what he was kind of known for doing. He had this, because he kind of built a lot of his ministry on this principle of reaching young men.
Yeah.
And he was very much like a kind of Jordan Peterson-esque figure in the sense of that's the way he was sort of perceived, as this reformer of young men who, need to get their lives in order and back in shape and be more masculine and, get their lives on track.
Get your stuff together.
Which, isn't a bad thing in and of itself. Obviously, that's very abusable, but it's a noble cause and something that I think is very much needed. But
agreed.
Yeah, there are ways of doing it.
There's a whole spectrum of ways to go about doing that. Some are better, some are worse.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of that particular clip?
I'd like to, before we even get talking about the actual content, I want to I want to iterate. I've only ever heard reiterate. Is iterate a word?
Yeah, iterate's a word.
Okay. I don't know if it's the right word. I would like to put it out there. The two people who are talking about this subject right now.
Right.
Really quick,
Because we're
Raph.
coming from very different perspectives.
Very different perspectives. Raph, how would you identify yourself, especially relating to this kind of content?
How would I identify myself? Well, I am a born-again Christian. I would consider myself, I'm very slow to label myself as an evangelical just because of the connotations that term has in our culture.
That's not exactly a cultural thing, not like a theological thing.
Exactly. But theologically, there is no other tradition that I really align with. I have been in what would be considered evangelical style churches, Protestant churches, my entire life, or at least in my entire church-going life. So that's not a label I would apply to myself, but it is a label that, if applied to me, would not necessarily be inaccurate.
Yeah, it is theologically accurate, but culturally inaccurate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's sort of, I think, my perspective. And you would be...
I am an atheist. No, no. I'm actually really not. I'm a very strange amalgamation of spiritual and other beliefs. However,
you're sort of on this, would you say you're in that spiritual but not religious trend?
I would call myself solidly agnostic.
Whoa, that's a tough word. You sure about that?
I think I can take it. I would call myself solidly agnostic. I believe a lot of things that if I were to label them God would label me a Christian. But I just don't believe the things that are required to make me an actual Christian.
You might have to elaborate on that, but maybe not in this
that might
conversation.
Be sometime later. Yeah, I mean, we in our private talk, we agree about a lot of things that you might consider to be like more like Christian values, but I just think are general, like are just spiritual values that I find appear a lot in a lot of different kinds of spiritual practices, and I prefer to think of myself as believing in, what do you call it, like non-institutionalized generic religion. Yeah,
like universal truth, so to speak.
Yeah.
But and that's part of the thing, you see, though, is that I do also believe that the Christian worldview is a universal truth.
Yes.
And therefore, that truth can be found elsewhere if it is in fact true.
Exactly. And
that was something that C.S. Lewis once famously said, where he was saying when he was an atheist, he had to believe that somehow a majority of people had got it wrong, because a majority of people have religious views of some kind.
Well, here's the thing.
But he said when he became a Christian, he felt a lot more open to acknowledging that there were elements of truth in all sorts of different worldviews.
Exactly. That is why I am not an atheist, because I don't think that the majority of people have it wrong. I think literally everybody has it wrong. And that's the fundamental difference between me and an atheist. Right. Atheists have very strong religious beliefs. They don't understand that, but they do. I don't have those. I don't share the same beliefs as an atheist, which is why the only label that would be left would be agnostic. However, I think more importantly, I also am what I would call a reformed sociopath.
Right.
And I think that applies more so in this context.
Yes. So let's talk about sociopathy and Mark Driscoll. So yeah, from your perspective, what sort of notes do you have after I showed you that clip?
Okay.
The famous Mark Driscoll shouting at his congregants, "How dare you?"
So I'll say now on the record what I was saying immediately after you showed me that video. First of all, it's a really funny video.
It's entertaining.
It's entertaining.
Certainly.
I found it to be quite amusing. And it's a classic case of perfectly fine, acceptable message with the wrong tone. And apparently, if what you say is true, if this is just his thing, straight inappropriate. Like if this is his just walking around vibes, that is not good. That is just hard truths intervention, just like slam a book in front of somebody and say, read this, just the once though, and then, go on and fix your life. However, if that's just his walking around, this is what you need to do, and your life is going to fall apart if you don't believe this all the time, man, the kind of adrenaline fatigue his congregation must be under all the time must be intense.
Yeah, well, you're not wrong. That, I think, is one of the large contributing factors to their downfall. When you hear the accounts of the people they interview in the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, it's very much that sort of thing. Well, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later in talking about trauma. We'll have to circle back to that subject after the fact. But specifically spiritual trauma, and the kind of spiritual trauma that a lot of people reported after coming out of that congregation. Well, as survivors, really. But yeah, so what else was in your initial impressions?
So, just looking at the guy, he looks like a sociopath. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it's just that we can, we know our own kind.
Your own.
Yeah, we recognize our own kind. It's like, that man looks like a predator. There's something about him being on stage, being completely calm, and delivering this message of just pure determinant. Like, the only thing I can think to describe it is a measured, structured rage.
Right.
And that is a very sociopathic thing to do. It's just like, I am going to portray this emotion in a very practiced manner. And of course, as somebody who is, I assume he's doing that, weekly?
At least.
He probably has that just down pat. But that's the kind of thing that sociopaths do well, which is jump from one emotion to another really quickly, really smoothly, and very practiced. We don't necessarily feel emotions in the same way that other people do. So our emotions are very practiced. They're very rehearsed. So you can go from calm and there's something wrong with you to just, what is wrong with you?
Yeah.
Like, who do you think you are? And with a very, very practiced rage. Like his eyes, if you look at his eyes, just blank, consistent the entire time. It's his voice, his tone, his mannerisms that change. And that's the thing that he gets that's the thing that really gives him away, I think. It's just like when he's looking out into the audience, his eyes are exactly the same, whether he's speaking calmly or whether he's raising his voice. It is very obviously practiced.
No, that's actually an interesting point that they get into in the podcast, which is obviously that was a very famous moment in a very viral, probably one of the most viral clips. No, it is the most viral clip that came out of Mars Hill's sermons. And Mike Cosper, the host of the podcast, he was talking about how like there was something a little bit off in that particular clip that does seem a little bit less organic than a lot of his other ones. And in interviewing people from leadership in Mars Hill at that time, because so after that sermon happened, Mark Driscoll was interviewed on like a radio show, a local radio show or something like that.
They're just like, what the heck happened?
Basically. And they're like, yeah, like what went into that? What led up to that moment? And the way he talked about it was he was like, oh, yeah, it was a very kind of organic ththing. I was just basically
going off the cuff.
Yeah. He talks about how I have very loose sermon notes, and I was just kind of going off the cuff. And I just, it's just sort of got into this mode of addressing the men in my church as if I was like counseling them. And so I would talk like the way I would in like a private counseling session, which it is known that that's the way he talks when counseling men in more private circumstances.
He says counseling, he means yelling.
Yeah. What he means is beating you into shape. And yeah, he just kind of portrayed it as this like very off the cuff, organic explosion. But apparently, if you ask any of the people who were behind the scenes at that church at that time, they would say that moment was rigorously rehearsed.
Called it.
Apparently, it was very much planned because it was a planned attempt to recreate the energy of a moment that happened very early on in the church's history that was not recorded.
I see.
And yeah, there was like a private event basically where he brought a bunch of men, to the church and basically yelled at them for several hours straight in a similar manner to, kind of stand them up or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was basically a controlled attempt to recreate that, which is why I think a lot of that sort of staging that you notice, that's peculiar though, that you could see that just like at a glance though.
Yeah.
Because Mike Cosper was even saying, he was rewatching that clip like hundreds of times while working on the show. And he was just like, there's just something off about this.
Yeah.
But you could see it in his eye lines. Like he's obviously, you could tell that he's very aware of the cameras.
Yes.
And
he's
playing to the
several
audience.
times looks directly at the camera. Darting eye lines is something that you notice when somebody is thinking very intensely.
Mm-hmm.
When you're performing the thing that you have rehearsed, there's usually not much formulation of thoughts that you have to do. It's just memorization and then saying it, right?
Mm-hmm.
He had very clear eye lines, looking at the camera, looking at the audience, that one individual dude, I see you. He knew exactly what he was going to say. There were several times when he had things like where he was just listing off things back to back to back, clear eye line. He did not have to think about what those things were that he was about to list off. Those were prepared and listed exactly as it was written in whatever notes he had previous. You can tell when somebody is about to list off, when somebody is extremely actually riled up and they have their blood's pumping and they have a lot of hormones that are messing with your internals, you think differently. It is hard to formulate clear and cohesive thoughts, let alone a whole list of them.
Yeah.
So he did that like at least twice, I think, where he just like went off listing things that were happening. And it was just like, this guy knows exactly what he's about to say. It is rehearsed. Almost, I would say, it looks like it was rehearsed down to the word.
Yeah. Yeah, it may very well have been. And that's the interesting thing, because you're talking about how, like, just at a glance, you can kind of recognize he looks like a sociopath.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, like Mark
especially in that clip.
Especially in that clip, given that it was very rehearsed. But the image that Mark Driscoll projected was very much a part of his brand. And you could kind of tell, like, just looking at him, like, what kind of appeal, right? Like he was trying to get. Because like I said, he very much made it a part of his ministry strategy to target young men and set them straight and bring them into the church. And like, he looks like that kind of, right? Like, I don't know how to describe it, but like that pseudo, like, fatherly type, right? Like
he looks like a youth leader. Like he looks like
he's broad shouldered, you know, he's like, he's
got like a really hip haircut.
Yeah. Well, the hip was definitely a big part of the culture at that church, apparently. Yeah. It was very much
like a mohawk. He's a priest. He's a pastor with a mohawk.
Yeah, it was very much a jeans and tattoos kind of, you know, indie alt rock kind of vibes. At that, apparently that was just the culture of that church. It was very the way it was sort of billed, at least at a superficial level, was very theologically conservative, but very culturally progressive. Right. Like, you at a glance, it's just like, oh man, look at these people.
I can feel comfortable here.
Yeah, I can feel comfortable. That, again, all part of the appeal.
All part of the image.
Yeah, all part of the image.
Well, what's the right term? Oh, superficially charming image.
Right, which you always remind me is one of the defining characteristics of sociopathy.
Yep.
Sociopathy and psychopathy, correct?
Correct. Sociopathy and psychopathy share symptoms, but originate from different things. Just really quick, if you want to know the difference between a sociopath and a psychopath, sociopaths are made, psychopaths are born. Sociopaths are created as a result of trauma, and psychopaths are born with chemical deficiencies.
Right.
But symptoms are roughly the same. There are differences, but
they express themselves in similar manners.
Yes. The main difference is sociopaths are more prone to outbursts and genuine anger. Psychopaths have nothing.
Right. They just don't feel.
Yeah.
So now that we've discussed that particular example of Mark Driscoll's ministry style, and again, that kind of brings us back around to the discussion of masculinity that I was kind of opening us on. Because, like you said, it's a good message, technically, right? Like,
if you listen to what he's saying, there's nothing wrong with it.
Thing. Yeah, like, it was very much like, first starting with some ground level opinions here, right? Just to sort of set our perspectives. Like, that is, I believe, a much needed thing, you know, to get like young men into a direction in life, you know, because there are cultural problems like that exist in our society. There are a lot of directionless young men who are getting very confused and mixed messages from different parts of our culture that can use concise direction. And, you know, specifically Mark Driscoll, I believe it was related to some stuff in his past, did genuinely have, or demonstrably at least, had a concern for women who are being abused or women that were abandoned, you know, or single mothers and things like that. Right. And it's like, that's something we care about as well. But like his tactics and the way he spiritually formed his church, it was problematic in a lot of ways. And it created a very toxic culture because like you said, that was basically an intervention style, you know, berating, and interventions are good. They're necessary every once in a while.
It's fine if it happens once. You only need to be intervened a singular time.
Yeah, but that was basically the modus operandi of Mars Hill, and particularly of Mark Driscoll. And that was one of the characteristics of that church that is now on kind of like the bingo checklist of how to tell if, you know, there's a leadership or, you know, spiritual formation or abuse problem at your church, is if a pastor is reluctant to share the pulpit. And Mark Driscoll apparently did like all of the preaching after a certain point at that church. Very early on in their history, it wasn't that way, but eventually it became that way as he grew more and more powerful.
Right.
So yeah, that's the thing. That was the way it was, like, basically constantly. And that does something to you if that's the way you're being churched. Right. Because I remember there were a lot of anecdotes that they had in the podcast exploring interviews with different congregants who had come out of Mars Hill and different people in leadership as well, who talked about how it was just like, I was just becoming an angrier, more aggressive person and taking risks and doing things that like I wouldn't otherwise have done. And Mark Driscoll was like very enabling of a lot of that kind of behavior. So that was just the sort of model he represented. And that was the way a lot of people began to follow, was this very aggressive form of masculinity, which is interesting because I think, especially on the right and especially on the far right end of the spectrum, I feel like aggression is always touted as the defining characteristic of masculinity.
Right.
And I'm curious.
It's that warrior spirit kind of just
I'm curious where you lie on that. Because like, I don't necessarily think I agree with that.
They have mistaken assertiveness with violence.
Yes. Well, and I would say, because like aggression is a manifestation, I think, of the essential quality of masculinity, but it is not the essential quality itself.
No.
Because sometimes aggression is necessary.
So assertiveness is, I would say, the umbrella.
Oh, is that what you would say the defining quality is?
Not necessarily the defining quality, but like a solid number 2 or 1.5. I'm not sure what the number 1 is.
I was going to say assertiveness is probably a better, broader one, because the word I was thinking was confidence.
Confidence, yeah. That's a good one. Confidence and assertiveness, I would say,
I kind of like assertiveness better, though. I feel like that describes what I'm getting at better.
Yeah. Confidence is also important because I would say they're tied for number 1.
Okay.
If you want to talk about like traditional masculinity.
Right.
Assertiveness is, how would you go on and define assertiveness?
Assertiveness? In the same sense that I would have originally meant confidence as
Yeah.
I would say assertiveness is being decisive and competent and having a sort of authority that can be looked to, right? Like when a decision needs to be made or when something needs to be done.
Right. So that's, I think, the most important part of assertiveness is the ability to make decisions when decisions have to be made. Confidence is knowing that the decisions you are making are the right ones.
Mm-hmm. Or at least the best ones.
Well, at least the ones that you have the most confidence in. Confidence is making those decisions with a certainty. Right? You can be assertive without necessarily being confident. You can be the one who goes in and makes the decisions. Like it can be like mechanical in your decision making. Confidence is bringing the charisma and bringing in what people would call like
leadership.
Not leadership. I guess a little bit of leadership, but like presence.
Right. Presence. That's a good word for it. So
that confidence comes in. So you can be you could be an assertive individual without having that presence, and you can't have that presence without also being assertive. But together, you have what would be the traits of a good leader. And I think that's what the traditional masculinity, that's where that comes in, is both is a good marriage of assertiveness with confidence. And for some reason that has been, I don't know if it's just like an American thing, but we have been at war forever. And for some reason, and our country was defined on war.
Right.
We literally born out of war. We are born out of war. And for some reason that has become a replacement for confidence and assertiveness. Is not being a community leader, being a general on the battlefield.
Right.
And there has to be, and in any war, there has to be an other. There has to be somebody that you are fighting. And in order for you to be masculine, instead of being a community leader and bringing people up, you have to be fighting somebody, which means you have to be aggressive, which means you have to be violent. There has to be somebody that you are punching at. You have to be directing that violence towards something. Because a general cannot lead an army if there is nobody to fight.
Wow, I think you hit the nail on the head on that one. But I've never thought about that as originating from our warfare mentality and our warfare history. But I think, that probably does have a very direct impact on the way the image of masculinity sort of developed in this country's history.
And I do think a lot of these things are like very like kind of US culture problems.
Yeah.
Because the US has a lot of cultural problems. But that particular flavor of toxic masculinity is what we find here.
Yeah. Well, and that's the frustrating thing for me. And I think you've expressed similar frustration as well, is especially in this cultural moment that we're in now, where so many people like us who, I don't know, like to think deeply about these sort of subjects, find ourselves sort of politically homeless because there are major cultural issues that exist at the polar extremes of our culture and our politics.
Right.
And because, on the one end, you have this sort of toxic masculinity and a lot of, the far right's weird obsession with masculinity. It gets really weird. We were getting into some of the weeds of that earlier before we started recording. But then on the other opposite end, though, you have this assumption that uncritically denies any kind of masculinity as toxic masculinity, including what we have been referring to throughout this conversation and what we generally do in our conversations as traditional masculinity.
Right.
But I think perhaps a more broad term would be like healthy masculinity.
Yeah.
Right. Like, which is
just non-toxic.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
like
good.
It stands to reason that if there's such thing as a toxic masculinity, there would be such thing as a healthy one. Right. And just like that's getting lost in the weeds, you know, when we polarize to these extremes, because there's so many people that are concerned about toxic masculinity and so many people that have a really insecure masculinity that is being manipulated into toxicity.
Yeah.
And just it seems like there's less concern about finding, like locating and revitalizing healthy traditional masculinity.
I don't know if I have an answer for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially when it comes down to the current discourse around, let's just say, generally speaking, even gender roles, right?
Right.
It's not just masculinity. It's masculinity. It's femininity. It's like, what do those even mean? Do they even have a purpose in our culture as it stands today? All of these questions, obviously, there are no answers. They are just going to be the ideas that survive. When it comes to masculinity, there's this idea that I don't know how to explain it. People feel like they're being attacked.
Right.
And there's
a siege mentality.
There's a siege mentality. People feel like they are currently under siege, and the response is the thing that they are being sieged for. Like their answer to this, attack is to just double down on this kind of these unhealthy masculine traits.
It's a self-fulfilling cycle.
It's a self-fulfilling cycle, and because of that, that gets more
the attention.
That gets all the attention, and then people think that is what masculinity just looks like. When in reality, good, healthy masculine people don't have to talk about how masculine they are.
Right. So which is,
it just doesn't get talked about. And so you have this perception that masculinity is loud and violent and aggressive. And the thing that you see on Fox News, apparently, it's just a symptom of insecurity.
Right. Which is not an inherently masculine quality.
It turns out it is not a healthy quality for anybody. True. It being insecure. Confidence, I would say, is a very masculine trait. I would like to point out that masculinity and femininity are not sex specific. They are gendered, but everybody is on a spectrum, especially when it comes to gender. And
I think we need to talk more about spectrums.
I would love to talk about spectrums. Women can, guess what, have masculine traits while being feminine.
Yeah. Here, we have a very good friend who I think embodies this very much, though, right? She's a single mother.
Right.
And
I know exactly what you're talking about.
She's very much the man of her household. Like, if you take one look at her, you could tell, right? Just the way she carries herself, the way she behaves, like she fulfills, because, and I think a lot of that is by necessity, right? Just being in that circumstance of being a single mother, like she had to step into that role. But like, she's also just like, if you get to know her, a very feminine person. Right.
And she has this massive truck. Well, she had a massive truck. Apparently the truck broke down and she had to sell
rip
it.
Truck.
I know. That truck was fun. She had a massive truck. Like, she was an armed guard for a lot of her work. Like, that's...
And buff as heck.
She's strong. She can pick me up.
Yeah.
I'm like 210 pounds. Like, she is like what normal people would look at and think like, like that is a very masculine, butch, for lack of a better word, like woman. And then if you talk to her and get to know her, she's just like, she's so like giggly and laughy, and and she just loves, cute stuff. But like she has that other side that is not traditionally feminine, that does not detract from her femininity.
Yeah.
Femininity.
Yeah.
That's a tough word to say. Spectrums.
Yeah.
It turns out things aren't black and white. Things aren't binary. You can't only be one thing.
Yeah. Well, some people are, and that's the problem. You know what I mean?
A lot of those people are trying very hard to. It is artificial. If somebody's actually binary in terms of like, I am exactly this, they are trying to be that.
Right. Well, and I think we have a culture that encourages that, though, right? Like this is part of this whole identity politics trend of, you have to know what defines you. You have to have a clear and concise narrative that identifies what specifically you are, and you cannot deviate from that one iota. Otherwise, you're like a traitor. Apparently, there are entire camps of people waiting, ready to call you a traitor.
Like they're just like staring at you and just like in a crouched pounce position, just like, do it. I know you wanna.
Yeah. And this goes for like every side of the aisle.
Everything.
It's a known issue.
Yeah.
Well, added to the list of known issues.
Added to the list of known issues.
This is a recurring thing we have in our conversations. It's like, in the programming patch notes, it'll be like known issues, right? Like bugs we didn't address in this patch, but are known issues. It's just like we have like humanity's known issues list we just keep a tab on in our conversations. That is just, I don't know what to do about that. It's just a known issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is why.
No prescribed fix. Known issue.
Yeah. I am intentionally trying to live my life. I want to be an object. I am fine being a human being.
You want to be objectified, Loryn?
However, in public, I want to be an object that confuses the hell out of me. I want to be
because I think this goes for both of us, but I think it should go for really any complete human being.
Right.
That you should befuddle people a little bit. You know what I mean?
I want you to look at me and go like, I have a complete set of rules about how the world works in my head. And this breaks those rules. Yeah.
Well, this was something I said in conversation with somebody else just the other day, is like, this is something that I get often talked about, maybe not necessarily often talked about, but something that has been acknowledged about me, I think is fairly acknowledged about you as well, is that we are both in ourselves category breakers.
Right.
People don't tend to have categories for who we are.
Right.
We do not fit neatly into a lot of boxes. You know what I mean? Like this, in terms of like how we divide our identity politics in this day and age.
Right. Right.
And that's kind of okay.
Yeah.
You probably
there's nothing wrong with having a personality.
Oh wow, get wrecked. All right, so a couple last notes on Mars Hill though, and more particularly the rise and fall of Mars Hill.
Right, the podcast.
Yeah, so I want to address a couple more things about that, but specifically I wanted to talk about trauma because I said we'd circle back around to that.
That's right, you did say that. We're doing it right now.
We're doing it right now.
We're pulling a Yui.
So there was a particular clip that occurs in the intro of that podcast that also was, we hear the interview that it comes from very late in the series. I think it was in like the last episode even. But there was some sort of psychologist, psychiatrist, I don't know, what do you call them? Some sort of counselor.
Some sort of mental health professional.
Some sort of mental health professional that was counseling a lot of the survivors of Mars Hill.
Oh, that's rough to put it that way.
Yeah. And one thing that they talked about in their interview for this podcast was this idea. And I thought this was pretty interesting because I think trauma is something we think about a lot.
Right.
And kind of do a lot of study on, especially in just trying to unpack a lot of our own.
Right.
But he introduced this concept, and I thought this was worth meditating on, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it, was this idea. He said, we have this idea about trauma that it is like a singular sudden event. And he talked about when he was counseling a lot of these people that came out of Mars Hill, right? They went to that church for years.
Right.
Right. And then now they're coming to counseling afterwards. And he's just like, you got PTSD.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, what do I have to be traumatized about? Is basically the
nothing
reaction.
Happened to me.
Yeah, nothing happened to me. Like there was no singular sudden event. But the way he put it was, there is a certain kind of trauma that comes with living with that kind of insistence, right? And the toxic leadership culture that they had at that church, where basically Mark Driscoll was authoritarian, right? His word was final. And, again, cultivating this very aggressive culture in the midst of all that. But yeah, living with that kind of insistence over a long period of time, there's a kind of trauma that comes with that. And he says when that stops suddenly, because like your body is essentially in just like a fight or flight mode for years at that point. And then when that suddenly stops, that affects you in a way that you might not understand because you didn't realize what mode you were in prior to that.
There is a thing called adrenal fatigue, where if somebody is in a high stress or even a low stress, but consistent environment, and you are constantly in a fight or flight, just elevated alertness mode at all times, there is a thing called adrenal fatigue where your body is used to having an actual, like a chemical driving it constantly. And then once that goes away, or even just like having too much of it, you become like, you crash. You have like a kind of withdrawal symptoms of this chemical that your body produces naturally that it became dependent on.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden you have all of this emotional fallout because you don't know where that came from. Yeah. Right. Because it's change blindness.
Yeah. And then suddenly like your mood changes and you don't know why. And then, you have all these, you have these really big swings because your body's trying to figure out how to replace and, continue moving forward without this constant injection of adrenaline.
Right. Yeah. So I thought that was an interesting point of note because I hadn't considered that concept before of this more kind of gradual trauma that can happen.
Yeah.
That just comes with, living that way over a long period of time, living in a fight or flight mode. So, I just thought that was an interesting concept. But it is very much a quintessential podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. I'd recommend anybody listen to it, really, but, especially Christians or especially American evangelical Christians who are in that sort of world. It's a very deep dive case study, and it's very emblematic of a lot of problems that are faced across the church spectrum broadly in this country.
Right.
But it's a fascinating case study. If you want to see like a good deep dive, it's a very well told story, very well produced. So highly recommended podcast. Thumbs up.
The official RAF approval.
Yeah. But and I think it's part of this growing trend that I'm seeing in the church world now, that is this growing awareness of spiritual abuse and what it is.
Yeah.
Because that wasn't really a term that was in our lexicon much prior to these recent years, at least not very widespread.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it wasn't something that the average person would have been aware of. Like, obviously, these things have been happening for a while, and like there are professionals who study that, and that would be known within mental health and or people who are in authority positions. They would be aware that might be a problem, but the average person wouldn't be part of their normal language. That wouldn't be something they were aware of that could even happen.
Yeah. So, but that's the thing, and I'm very, I'm kind of sad for all the incidents that have served as case studies for it, but I'm very glad that there is a growing awareness of what spiritual abuse is and how to detect it.
Yeah.
And I think that's ultimately something that's going to better the church.
Yeah.
Although I think also there's a lot of reform that needs to happen that thankfully we do see happening in a lot of church circles. And I don't know, I think that kind of makes me a little hopeful for the future. But, it's come at the cost of like a lot of rockiness and divisiveness right now.
Yeah.
Especially when it's, kind of drawing factional lines within certain church circles and certain denominations. And obviously the SBC is like a battleground right now. We don't even have to get into that. But
for those who don't know, the SBC is the Southern Baptist Church.
Southern Baptist Convention.
The Southern Baptist Convention. And it is...
Well, it's the largest...
It is politically and religiously interesting.
Because it's politically and religiously significant. It's the largest Christian denomination in the United States. And
they pull political weight.
And the policies and culture that you find within the SPC is often very indicative of trends of policy and culture that you'll find just in the political spectrum as well, or in the cultural spectrum in the United States more broadly, because it's just such a massive denomination that has a huge amount of influence. But anyway, so that was the last sort of thing I kind of wanted to address from Mars Hill.
Right.
Should we go into a segment of sorts? Do we have time?
I
do you think the horoscope's going to be short?
The horoscope's going to be short.
Did you know?
Raph, do you know what your horoscope is? I tried looking up horoscope.
That must have yielded some interesting results.
Let me tell you what, I didn't find what I was looking for, but I found something else that was just completely different. It's horoscope, not horoscope. For those who know a little bit better than I, that's probably an amateur mistake. However, horoscope.
Yeah, I think, have we talked about horoscopes before on this podcast?
Absolutely not, I don't think.
I want to say there might have been something we referenced, but
maybe?
I don't know. That led to adding this to the list. But either way.
That might potentially be the reason why we added it to the list. However, do you know what your horoscope is?
No idea.
Okay, me neither. However, I found a horoscope that I think perfectly describes you, Raph.
Oh, is that right?
I would like to read this out loud.
Okay, hit me. You're saying, did I know this was my horoscope? Is that why this is the Did You Know segment?
Yes. So I have found a horoscope that I will read out loud to you. And I want you to just meditate on it as I read this to you, and I want you to think how well this might describe you. Because, I went online, put in all the information.
Oh boy, I'm ready.
You have a great need for other people to like and admire you. You have a tendency to be critical of yourself. You have a great deal of unused capacity that you have not turned to your advantage. While you have some personality weaknesses, you are generally able to compensate for them. Disciplined and self-controlled outside, you tend to be worrisome and insecure inside. At times, you have serious doubts as to whether you have made the right decision or done the right thing. You prefer a certain amount of change and variety and become dissatisfied when hemmed in by restrictions and limitations. You pride yourself as an independent thinker and do not accept others' statements without satisfactory proof. You have found it unwise to be too frank in revealing yourself to others. At times, you are extroverted, affable, and sociable, while at other times, you are introverted, wary, reserved. Some of your aspirations tend to be pretty unrealistic. I forgot about that line. Security is one of your major goals in life. Now, I put in your information, got this horoscope out. On a scale of 1 to 5, how accurate would you say this horoscope is?
With one being like...
One being like, that doesn't even describe a human being. That's not close to what I think. 5 being, I'm actively thinking those words right now.
Oh, man. It'd have to be pretty up there. That was very relatable.
It's very relatable, right?
Yeah.
Would you give it, what range would you give that?
I would say 4.5.
4.5.
Because, just because of the sometimes extroverted part.
The sometimes extroverted part, yeah. That docks a 0.5.
Yeah, that docks a 0.5. But overall, super relatable. It's like, wow. I've thought as much of that and have talked very seriously about it as recently as this week.
Yeah. And what I have just read to you has nothing to do with you.
So is this what you were telling me about a while back of the universal horoscope?
This is the universal horoscope. This actually wasn't originally designed to be a horoscope. This is a personality quiz answer that was developed by a psychologist to be the most relatable thing.
So that you just gave me the clinically, scientifically most relatable speech that could have ever been given.
You rated it a 4.5. On average, people who listen to this give it a 4.26.
Oh, wow.
So it's slightly more relatable to you than the average person. However, when read out or when reading this, even if it's told specifically like this is going to be directed towards you, and this is we took your information, when researchers will do this, they'll give a faux personality quiz or a faux horoscope quiz and just give your information, and we'll give it to a professional and they will analyze your information and then give you a unique personality assessment. And then they take that test, throw it away, and then hand them this.
Just to see
how
people react.
And on average, 4.26, with almost 0 people rating it below a 3.
Whoa, that's crazy.
Yeah. So there's the
most relatable set of words.
This is the most relatable personality type.
And has just been administered to our entire listening audience.
Yes, you, listening audience as well. How well did this describe you? I would like to know.
However, tag us on Twitter or something. I would like to know if literally anybody who listened to this has a vibe.
This is called the Forer effect. I believe that's the name of the person who created this. B.R. Forer. This is his personality test. It's called the Forer effect, and it has since been used to explain why things like horoscopes and personality quizzes and all these other things can be so right, because they contain statements such as, you have some personality weaknesses, but you are generally able to compensate for them.
Right. That describes literally everybody.
Literally everybody. That describes a human being. It's like, you are not perfect, but you're still alive.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like some of these are more obvious than others. For example, where is the one that's the most obvious? Oh, right. The one where it says you are at times you're extroverted, affable, and sociable, while other times you are introverted, wary, and reserved. That described the 2 kinds of people.
Yeah, exactly. That's literally, yeah. If you say those,
it's a 50-50 chance.
Yeah, it's a 50-50 chance, but you're going to describe most anybody.
Yeah, there's a 50-50 chance somebody's going to agree with the first half or the other half.
Yeah, you cover both your bases within the same sentence.
Yeah. So and of course most people on the if talking about a spectrum again, most people on the spectrum are somewhere in the middle. No one's a true extrovert, no one's a true introvert. Not very many people, I should say, are true extroverts and true introverts.
Right.
Most people have a
are a blend.
So 4.26 is what the average person will relate. How much the average person will relate to that statement of just, sometimes I'm outgoing, other times I'm not outgoing, which are the 2 kind of modes of being outgoing.
Yeah. So all this is further evidence on your pile of astrology and horoscopes are nonsense.
Absolute nonsense. However, gosh, they're fun.
Yeah, this is a train you've been riding for a while. Is that horoscopes are nonsense? And
horoscopes and personality quizzes, because horoscope is just a very particular kind of personality quiz.
That's fair.
And personality quizzes have been scientifically proven to never be accurate. Except they're just always so accurate for some reason.
Yeah,
because they're almost
by design.
It's almost like they're designed to appeal to a very specific group of people, which are like
people who
human
look
beings.
for personality quizzes.
People who look for personality quizzes. If you are already biased towards looking for personality quizzes and horoscopes, you are more likely to rank this even higher.
Yeah,
because you're looking for those answers to be like, yes, that's exactly what I believe in. And this effect has been, unfortunately, it has been taken advantage of by people like psychics and mediums and things like that, who will prey on people who want those answers and will generally give you these kinds of readings of just here's a very general idea of what describing a human being, see what you agree to, and then go down that route. There's a technique called cold reading, which maybe I'll talk about sometime later in the future, which I love. But
have you seen Orson Welles talk about cold reading?
I have not.
It's hilarious.
I would love to hear what Orson Welles has to say about cold reading. Isn't Orson Welles a magician?
He dabbles.
Of course, obviously.
Yeah, he is a big fan of magic, though. Yeah, he loves magic.
There are so many people that I have found to be fans of magic that I think, like, I would never have thought, but man, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, it explains a lot when you know that Orson Welles loves magic.
Yeah, and it explains especially how he approaches entertainment and, like, creating films. He thinks like a magician. And,
that's the thing, right? The magic and film have a long shared history.
Yeah.
And Orson Welles is really he's a latecomer, relatively, to the advent of film, at least, in our distant past now. But he's very much tapping into that tradition of that fusion between magic and filmmaking and bringing that uniquely to the screen in a way that hadn't been done before, which is probably a large part of how he made such a masterpiece on his first film.
Yeah.
First time ever even getting into film, period. Even picking up a camera.
Right.
And makes what is now generally considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest film ever made. Which is Citizen Kane, for those who don't know who Orson Welles is. But yeah.
Fantastic creator and fantastic human being.
I probably have to do a deep dive on Orson Welles on this podcast at some point. Because
I would love to hear you talk about Orson Welles more.
I love Orson Welles, man. Orson Welles is one of my creative heroes of all time. Yeah, one of all-time creative heroes. I think I have about 4 people who I would cite as my all-time biggest creative heroes that have influenced me the most.
Right.
And they're very different kinds of creators, and which is why I draw something very completely different from each one.
Yeah.
And maybe that'll be a whole thing I have to talk about at some point.
Well,
or just like for both of us, really, who are our creative heroes?
Yeah, I talked about that in the last episode, talking about some of my favorite artists.
Right.
But I think expanding it to just creative heroes, absolutely.
Who are the people who influenced your creativity the most? And I can narrow it down to 4.
Yeah.
Right. These are 4 representatives, right? These aren't all of them, but these are, if I could pick one person to represent every lesson and influence that I've gained, it would be these 4 people.
I don't know what number I have, but I can definitely start making a list, because now that I'm thinking about it, I can think of 2 or 3 already.
Yeah, some tentpoles for sure. Yeah. All right, well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this episode, so let's wind this one to a close. Thank you all very much for listening. This show is edited by Loryn Pacheco, mixed by Raphael Pacheco, with theme music by Mono Memory. Until next time, we'll see you all later. God bless.
Later, Gator.